My mother never told me she was dying. That revelation came 3 weeks after her funeral, when I discovered the letters hidden beneath the floorboards of her childhood bedroom. Letters that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, and lead me down a path neither she nor I could have anticipated. I'm Sarah Chen, 43 years old, standing in the empty Victorian house my mother had left me in her will. The house sat perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean in a forgotten corner of Northern California. A property I hadn't even known existed until her attorney handed me the deed. My mother, Margaret Chen, had been a woman of secrets, but this was different. This felt deliberate, like she had been preparing me for something I wasn't ready to understand. The letters were wrapped in faded silk, bound with a ribbon that had once been red but had turned rust-colored with age. 27 letters in total, each one addressed to me but never sent, written over the span of 40 years. The first was dated 1985, the year I was born. The last was dated just 3 months before her death. Make sure you're sitting down for what I'm about to tell you, because what I discovered in those letters changed everything I thought I knew about my mother, my father, and the inheritance that came with consequences I never could have imagined. The first letter began with an apology. "My dearest Sarah," it read in my mother's elegant handwriting. "By the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will hate me for what I've kept from you. But please understand that every secret I held was a chain I wore to protect you from a truth that could destroy everything we built together. Your father was not the man I told you he was. Your father was not even the man whose name appears on your birth certificate. The truth is far more complicated and far more dangerous than I ever wanted you to know." I sat on the dusty floor of that bedroom, surrounded by decades of silence, and began to piece together the story my mother had spent a lifetime hiding. She had been 23 when she met a man named Vincent Castellano at a charity gala in San Francisco. He was 15 years older, sophisticated, wealthy, and according to every newspaper article I would later find, the heir to one of the largest shipping empires on the West Coast. What the newspapers didn't mention, what my mother's letters revealed in painful detail, was that Vincent Castellano was also deeply entangled with organized crime. Their affair had been passionate and brief. My mother described nights of champagne and promises, weekends at his estate in Napa Valley, dreams of a future that seemed inevitable until she discovered she was pregnant. That's when everything changed. Vincent's family, powerful and ruthless, had other plans for their golden son. Plans that didn't include a middle-class art teacher and her unexpected child. What happened next would make your blood run cold, because my mother didn't just walk away from Vincent Castellano. She was paid to disappear, and the price of that disappearance was her silence for the rest of her life. The second letter detailed the transaction with clinical precision. $2 million deposited into an account under a false name. A new identity arranged through channels she never fully understood. And most importantly, a contract signed in blood. Or rather, signed under the threat of what might happen if she ever revealed the truth about my paternity. Vincent's family had made it clear that speaking out would result in consequences not just for her, but for me, consequences that range from social destruction to something far more permanent. So my mother had taken the money, changed our names from Margaret Lynn to Margaret Chen, and moved us to Oregon where she raised me alone, telling me my father had died in a car accident before I was born. She had lived every day of my childhood in fear, watching over her shoulder, screening phone calls, never staying in one place too long. I had always attributed her anxiety to trauma, never imagining it was rooted in a very real and present danger. The third letter was different. It was written when I was 10 years old, right after I had come home from school crying because other children had made fun of me for not having a father. My mother described watching me through the kitchen window, seeing my pain, and almost breaking her silence right then. Almost telling me everything. But she hadn't, because that same week, a black car had appeared on our street. A car that parked outside our house for 3 consecutive evenings, watching, waiting, reminding her that the Castellano family never forgot and never forgave. Reading these letters felt like watching my entire childhood through a different lens. Every time we moved, every paranoid moment when my mother pulled me away from strangers who seemed too interested in us, every warning she gave me about being careful who I trusted, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. We hadn't been running from ghosts. We had been running from very real monsters who wore expensive suits and had the resources to track anyone, anywhere, anytime. But here's where the story takes a turn that will leave you questioning everything, because my mother hadn't just run and hidden. In those 40 years of silence, she had been building something, gathering evidence, creating an insurance policy that would protect me after she was gone. The later letters revealed a woman I had never known. My gentle, anxious mother had spent decades secretly documenting the Castellano family's criminal activities. She had collected financial records, recorded conversations, photographed meetings, all while maintaining her cover as a simple art teacher living a quiet life. She had turned her fear into fuel, her silence into a weapon, and by the time of her death, she had amassed enough evidence to bring down not just Vincent Castellano, but his entire family empire. And she had left it all to me, hidden in this house, waiting for me to discover it. The house itself was the final piece of her plan. She had purchased it 10 years ago using money she had carefully saved and invested, turning that initial $2 million into a fortune that none of the Castellanos knew existed. The Victorian mansion sat on 12 acres of coastal land, remote enough to be private, but close enough to civilization to be safe. She had spent the last decade of her life preparing it as a fortress, a place where I could make a choice she had never been given. That choice arrived on my 4th day in the house when a sleek black Mercedes pulled up the long driveway. A man emerged, tall and silver-haired, moving with the confident grace of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Even before he introduced himself, I knew who he was. Vincent Castellano. My father. The man whose existence I had only learned of 72 hours earlier. What he said next would change the trajectory of my entire life. He stood on the porch, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. Sarah Chun, he said, his voice smooth and cultured. Or should I say Sarah Castellano? I've waited a very long time to meet you. He didn't apologize for the decades of absence. Didn't explain why he had allowed my mother to raise me alone while he built his empire. Instead, he smiled, a cold, calculating smile that never reached his eyes, and told me that my mother's death had created an opportunity. You see, he explained as if discussing a business transaction, your mother and I had an agreement. She kept her silence, and in return, she and you were left alone. But now she's gone, and that agreement has ended. You are my daughter, my only child, and according to the laws of inheritance, you have certain rights to the Castellano estate. I stood in the doorway of my mother's house, this fortress she had prepared for me, and listened as my biological father laid out his proposition. He wanted me to acknowledge my paternity publicly, to take my place in the Castellano family, to inherit not just his wealth, but his entire empire. In return, all I had to do was forget everything my mother had taught me about them. Forget the fear that had shaped my childhood. Forget the secrets she had died protecting. And here's the part that will make your heart race, because Vincent Castellano wasn't making an offer. He was delivering an ultimatum disguised as an opportunity. He explained that the Castellano family had known about my mother's evidence gathering for years. They had allowed it because she posed no real threat as long as she remained silent. But now, with her death, the equation had changed. The evidence existed, and I was the only person who knew where it was and how to use it. I could join the family and help them secure their legacy, or I could become a problem that needed solving. And the Castellanos had proven methods for solving problems. I thought of my mother's letters, her decades of fear and preparation. I thought of the little girl who had cried about not having a father, never knowing that her father was alive and perfectly capable of being part of her life, but had chosen money and power instead. I thought of the inheritance I had received, not just the money and property, but the evidence that could destroy the man standing before me. Then I looked Vincent Castellano in his cold eyes, and told him I needed time to think. He smiled again, that same calculating expression, and nodded. Of course. You have 1 week to decide, Sarah. After that, the offer expires, and we'll need to explore other options for ensuring our family's privacy. He handed me a business card, heavy stock with embossed gold lettering. When you're ready to discuss your future, call me. Then he walked back to his Mercedes and drove away, leaving me standing in the doorway of my inheritance, caught between two impossible choices. That night, I continued reading my mother's letters. The later ones took on a different tone, less fearful, more strategic. She had known this moment would come, had predicted it with eerie accuracy. In letter 23, written just 6 months before her death, she laid out exactly what I should expect after she was gone. Vincent will come for you, she wrote. He'll offer you the world, make you feel like you've finally found the father you always wanted. But remember, Sarah, a man who would pay to erase his own child is not a man who suddenly develops paternal instincts. He wants something from you, and what he wants is your silence and your complicity. Don't give him either. But my mother hadn't just warned me. She had given me a roadmap, a step-by-step guide for what to do next, and it started with 3 words that appeared in bold, underlined text. Find the others. The others. At first, I didn't understand what she meant. But as I continued reading, the picture became clear. I wasn't Vincent Castellano's only secret child. My mother had discovered, through her decades of careful investigation, that Vincent had fathered at least 3 other children with different women over the years. Each one paid off, each one silenced, each one living under the same threats that had governed my mother's life. Their names were in letter 24, along with last known addresses and brief descriptions of how my mother had located them. Jessica Moreno, 38, living in Seattle, daughter of a hotel clerk Vincent had been involved with in the late 80s. Marcus Webb, 41, living in Austin, son of a corporate attorney who had worked briefly for Castellano Shipping. And most surprisingly, Lily Zhang, 35, living in San Francisco itself, daughter of an executive assistant who had been part of Vincent's inner circle. My mother had spent the last 5 years of her life tracking them down, verifying their identities, and confirming their connection to Vincent Castellano. But she had never contacted them, never revealed what she knew. That task, she explained in her letter, was meant for me. Because while one silenced child could be ignored or eliminated, for children, all appearing simultaneously with corroborated evidence of Vincent's criminal activities, that would be much harder to suppress. What my mother had created wasn't just insurance. It was a weapon of mutually assured destruction. And she had left me the trigger. The question was whether I had the courage to pull it. I spent the next 3 days doing what my mother had spent years perfecting. Research, investigation, verification. I used her notes to locate Jessica, Marcus, and Lily, tracking their current addresses and situations. Jessica was a nurse, divorced with 2 children, living paycheck to paycheck. Marcus was a musician, struggling to make ends meet while pursuing his art. Lily was the most successful of us, a tech entrepreneur who had built a small but profitable software company. None of them knew about each other. None of them knew about me. And as far as I could tell from my investigation, none of them had any idea that the man whose DNA they carried was Vincent Castellano, one of the most powerful men on the West Coast. On the 4th day, I made my decision. I wasn't going to call Vincent. I wasn't going to accept his offer or submit to his threats. Instead, I was going to do what my mother had prepared me to do. I was going to find my siblings and together, we were going to confront the man who had created us, and then paid to pretend we didn't exist. But first, I needed to understand exactly what evidence my mother had gathered, and that meant exploring the house more thoroughly than I had before. The Victorian mansion revealed its secrets slowly. My mother had spent a decade turning it into a repository of information, each room serving a specific purpose in her long-term plan. The library on the 2nd floor contained shelves of carefully organized files, each one documenting a different aspect of Castellano family business. Legitimate shipping contracts sat alongside evidence of smuggling operations. Tax returns were filed next to offshore account statements that told a very different financial story. The attic had been converted into a surveillance center. Old recording equipment, cameras with telephoto lenses, computers with encrypted hard drives containing years of photographs and video footage. My mother had watched the Castellanos the way they had once watched her, turning the tables with patient, methodical precision. But the real treasure was in the basement. Behind a false wall that I only discovered because my mother's letters included detailed instructions, I found a climate-controlled vault containing the original copies of everything. Documents, recordings, photographs, all stored in a way that would hold up in court. Everything was labeled, cross-referenced, organized with the meticulous care of someone who knew that one day, this evidence might be all that stood between her daughter and disaster. As I stood in that vault, surrounded by my mother's 40-year project, I felt something shift inside me. The anger and confusion I had felt reading her letters transformed into something else. Respect, admiration, and a fierce determination to finish what she had started. My mother hadn't just survived the Castellanos. She had beaten them. She just hadn't lived long enough to see her victory. Now that responsibility fell to me, and I wasn't going to waste it. Reaching out to my newfound siblings proved more complicated than I had anticipated. You can't simply call someone and announce that you're their half-sister, and your mutual father is a criminal who paid your mothers to stay silent. There are social protocols for these things, though none of them covered this particular situation. I started with Jessica in Seattle, the nurse, because something about her story resonated with me. Like my mother, Jessica's mother had been working class, someone Vincent had encountered during a business trip, and left behind without a second thought. I crafted a careful email, vague enough not to alarm her but specific enough to pique her curiosity. I mentioned that I was researching family history, and had reason to believe we might be related. Could we meet for coffee? Her response came 3 days later. Brief, cautious, but interested. She suggested a public place, a cafe near the hospital where she worked. Smart woman. She was taking precautions just as I would have. The meeting was awkward at first. Jessica was shorter than me, with darker hair and eyes that held a weariness that came from years of hard living. We made small talk about Seattle weather and the traffic until finally, she leaned forward and asked the question that had clearly been bothering her since receiving my email. What is this really about, Sarah? We don't know each other. Why would you think we're related? I took a deep breath and pulled out the photograph my mother had included in her files. It showed Vincent Castellano at a hotel bar in 1986, his arm around a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Jessica. Your mother, I said quietly, sliding the photo across the table. And Vincent Castellano, your father. The color drained from Jessica's face. How did you get this? Who are you? What I told her next would blow your mind because Jessica's mother had told her the exact same story my mother had told me. Her father had died before she was born. She had never questioned it, never thought to look deeper. Now sitting in a Seattle cafe, her entire understanding of her own history was crumbling. I explained everything. My mother's letters, the evidence, the other siblings, Vincent's recent visit and ultimatum. Jessica listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, so tightly her knuckles turned white. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long moment. Then she said something that stopped me cold. He came to see me too. Vincent Castellano had visited Jessica 3 weeks before he came to me. He had appeared at the hospital where she worked, introduced himself as a family friend with information about her late father. He had taken her to dinner, charmed her with stories and attention, and then gradually revealed the truth about her paternity. But his version of the truth was very different from mine. In Vincent's telling, Jessica's mother had been an opportunist who had gotten pregnant deliberately to trap him into marriage. When he refused, she had demanded money and signed an agreement never to contact him again. He portrayed himself as the victim, a young man taken advantage of by a calculating woman. And he had made Jessica an offer. A trust fund, medical school tuition for her children, a life free of financial stress. All she had to do was sign a document acknowledging him as her father, but agreeing never to make that relationship public. Jessica had been on the verge of signing when my email arrived. Did you sign? I asked, already knowing the answer mattered more than I wanted to admit. She shook her head. Something felt wrong about it. Too convenient, too perfect. My mother never spoke about my father, but when she was dying, she made me promise never to trust anyone named Castellano if they ever came looking for me. I didn't understand what she meant until Vincent showed up. This changed everything. Vincent wasn't just trying to silence me. He was working systematically through all his illegitimate children, buying their loyalty or their silence before they could become problems. The question was whether he had already reached Marcus and Lily. And if so, whether they had been more receptive to his offers than Jessica. We need to find the others, Jessica said, echoing my thoughts. If he's manipulating all of us, we need to warn them. Or better yet, she smiled grimly, we need to unite and fight back. Looking at her across that cafe table, I saw not just a sibling, but an ally. Someone who understood the particular pain of being a secret, of carrying the weight of someone else's shame and lies. Together, we made a plan. We would travel to Austin to find Marcus, then to San Francisco for Lily. We would move quickly, before Vincent could consolidate his control over all of us. And we would do it using the one advantage we had that he didn't know about, my mother's evidence. The trip to Austin took 2 days. Marcus Webb was harder to locate than Jessica had been. He moved frequently, following music gigs and opportunities that never quite materialized into the career he dreamed of. We finally tracked him down at a dive bar where he was playing guitar for tips and beer. Marcus was the most Castellano-looking of us all, with the same silver-touched hair, the same sharp features, the same unconscious arrogance in the way he held himself. When we approached him after his set and asked to speak privately, his first reaction was suspicion bordering on hostility. "Look," he said, lighting a cigarette in the alley behind the bar, "if this is about money, I don't have any. And if it's about my father, I don't want to know. I've got enough problems without adding family drama." Jessica and I exchanged glances. Vincent had definitely been here. "When did he contact you?" I asked directly, no longer bothering with the careful approach I had used with Jessica. Marcus's expression confirmed my suspicion. 2 months ago. Showed up at a gig, bought me drinks, told me this crazy story about being my real father. Said my mother was a groupie who he had a brief relationship with, that she asked him to stay away because she wanted to raise me without his influence. He snorted. "Nice story, except it was bullshit. My mother loved him. Talked about him until the day she died. She didn't ask him to leave, he abandoned her. But he offered you something," Jessica prompted. "Money? Opportunities? A recording contract," Marcus admitted, looking embarrassed. "His family owns a record label. Small operation, but legitimate. He said he could get me studio time, proper distribution, everything I've been working toward my whole life. All I had to do was sign some papers, and keep quiet about our relationship." "And did you sign?" I asked. Marcus took a long drag on his cigarette. "Not yet. He gave me time to think about it, said I could review the contract with a lawyer. But here's the thing," he looked between Jessica and me. "The contract included a clause that would give Castellano Enterprises ownership of any music I created under their label. Everything I write would legally belong to him. I've been broke my whole life, but I'm not stupid enough to sign away the only thing I've got." That's when we told him everything. About my mother's letters, the evidence, the systematic way Vincent was trying to neutralize all his illegitimate children. Marcus listened with growing anger, his cigarette burning forgotten in his hand. "So," he concluded, "we're not children to him. We're liabilities being managed." "Exactly," I confirmed. "And separately, we're vulnerable. But together, with evidence of his crimes, we're something else entirely." "A threat," Marcus said softly. "We're a threat." The three of us returned to the dive bar, and spent the next several hours planning our approach to Lily. San Francisco was Vincent's home territory, and Lily, as the most financially successful of his secret children, might have already been fully co-opted into his world. Or she might be the strongest ally we could hope for. Someone with resources and connections that could help us confront Vincent on his own ground. We arrived in San Francisco on a Tuesday morning. Lily's software company was located in a modern office building in Soma, all glass and steel, and the kind of minimalist design that screamed success. Her assistant was professional but firm when we appeared without an appointment. "Ms. Zhang is in meetings all day. If you'd like to schedule something, I can check her availability next month." But Jessica had anticipated this. She pulled out her phone and showed the assistant a photograph, one of the many my mother had collected. It showed Vincent Castellano and a young Asian woman at a company event, their body language suggesting an intimate connection. "Just tell her that Vincent Castellano's other children are here to talk about their mother," Jessica said quietly. "I think she'll make time." 5 minutes later, we were ushered into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. Lily Zhang stood with her back to us, her silhouette sharp against the bright morning light. When she turned, I saw intelligence in her eyes, calculation in the set of her shoulders. This was a woman who had survived and thrived in the cutthroat world of technology, who had built something from nothing. She was also the only one of us who had known about Vincent all along. My mother never lied to me about who my father was, Lily said without preamble, gesturing for us to sit. She told me when I was 16. Told me about the money, the agreement, the threats. Told me that Vincent Castellano was a dangerous man who would only bring pain into my life if I let him. So I didn't. I took the advantages his money provided through my mother, and built something he could never touch. Then you know why we're here, I said. Lily smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I know Vincent has been contacting his illegitimate children, trying to bring them under his control before they become problems. I know you've been reaching out to them first, trying to build some kind of alliance. And I know that whatever you're planning, it's going to fail unless you have something Vincent wants more than he wants your silence. What could we possibly have that Vincent Castellano would want? Marcus asked skeptically. Lily walked to her desk and pressed a button. A screen descended from the ceiling, and she pulled up a series of financial documents. My mother wasn't the only one gathering evidence. I've spent the last 10 years documenting every illegal transaction, every bribe, every money laundering operation connected to Castellano shipping. I've got blockchain records of cryptocurrency transfers, offshore account information, communications with known criminal organizations. Everything admissible in court and devastating if made public. Why? Jessica asked. Why gather all this if you never plan to use it? Insurance, Lily replied simply. Vincent knows I have it. It's why he's never tried to bring me into the family or threaten me. We have a mutually assured destruction pact. He leaves me alone, I leave him alone. But that's changed now, I realized. We've changed the equation. Lily nodded. Exactly. 4 of his children, all with evidence, all potentially willing to coordinate against him. That's not a manageable problem anymore. That's an existential threat. So what do we do? Marcus asked. Lily looked at each of us in turn, her expression unreadable. We do what Vincent Castellano has spent his entire life avoiding. We tell the truth. All of it. Publicly. Together. And we use our combined evidence to make sure that when we do, there are consequences he can't buy or threaten his way out of. What she proposed next would make headlines around the world, because Lily's plan wasn't just about exposing Vincent Castellano. It was about dismantling the entire system that had allowed men like him to operate with impunity for generations. Over the next 2 weeks, the 4 of us worked in secret, coordinating our efforts and preparing for what Lily called the nuclear option. We compiled all the evidence, my mother's files, Lily's digital records, documents that Marcus's mother had saved, and medical records that Jessica obtained through her hospital connections. We verified everything, cross-referenced timelines, and built an airtight case. But we didn't go to the police. We didn't contact prosecutors. Instead, Lily arranged meetings with 3 major investigative journalism organizations, the kind with resources to protect sources and reputations strong enough that even Vincent Castellano couldn't intimidate them into silence. The night before our scheduled press conference, Vincent appeared at my mother's house. I had been expecting him. His 1-week deadline had long since passed, and I had ignored every message from his lawyers. Now he stood on the same porch where he had first delivered his ultimatum, but his demeanor had changed. The confident businessman was gone, replaced by someone who recognized he was losing control. You're making a mistake, Sarah, he said without preamble. Whatever you think you're accomplishing, you're only going to hurt yourself and those other children. Other children, I repeated. You can't even bring yourself to call us your sons and daughters. Because that's not what you are to me, he said bluntly. You're accidents. Mistakes from a time when I was less careful. Your mothers knew what they were getting into, and they were compensated fairly for their silence. My mother lived in fear for 40 years, I said, my voice steady despite my anger. Jessica's mother died alone and poor. Marcus's mother never recovered from losing you. And Lily's mother had to raise her daughter with the constant threat of violence hanging over them. You didn't compensate anyone. You bought silence through terror. Vincent's expression hardened. If you go through with whatever you're planning, you'll destroy more than just me. The Castellano family employs thousands of people. Legitimate businesses will collapse. Innocent lives will be ruined. Innocent lives, I said. Like the families of the people your organization has hurt over the years? The communities destroyed by the drugs you've smuggled? The workers exploited in your shipping operations? You don't get to claim moral high ground when your entire empire is built on suffering. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not regret, but something close. Calculation, perhaps. A final weighing of options. How much? He asked finally. Name your price. All of you. Whatever it takes to make this go away. I smiled then, and I knew it was the same cold smile he had given me weeks earlier. There isn't enough money in the world to buy what you're asking for. Tomorrow morning, the truth comes out. All of it. And you're going to face consequences for the first time in your life. Vincent Castellano left without another word. The next morning at precisely 10 a.m., Jessica, Marcus, Lily, and I stood together at a press conference in downtown San Francisco. We told our stories, all of them, to a room full of journalists and cameras. We presented our evidence, carefully curated to expose criminal activity without revealing sources who might be endangered. And we made it clear that this wasn't about money or revenge. It was about accountability. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Federal investigators who had been trying to build cases against Castellano Shipping for years suddenly had the evidence they needed. State prosecutors began filing charges. Financial institutions froze accounts. The carefully constructed empire that Vincent Castellano had built over decades began to crumble. But the most significant impact was personal. Other women came forward, women who had been paid to stay silent about their relationships with Vincent. Women who had children they had never acknowledged publicly. By the end of the first week, we had gone from 4 siblings to 9. From 9 to 15. The pattern of abuse and abandonment that Vincent had perfected over 40 years stood exposed for the world to see. 6 months later, Vincent Castellano stood trial on multiple federal charges. He was convicted on 17 counts including money laundering, racketeering, and tax evasion. The sentence was 30 years, effectively a life sentence for a man in his mid-60s. His legitimate business empire was dismantled, assets seized, properties sold to pay restitution to victims of his criminal enterprises. But the inheritance my mother had truly left me wasn't about destroying Vincent Castellano, though that was certainly a consequence of her planning. The real inheritance was the family I had gained. Jessica, Marcus, and Lily became my siblings in every sense that mattered. We supported each other through the trial, through the media circus, through the painful process of untangling our relationships with a man who had never truly been a father to any of us. The house on the cliff, the Victorian mansion my mother had turned into a fortress, became our gathering place. We would meet there several times a year, bringing partners and children, celebrating holidays, building the family connections that had been denied to us for so long. My mother's letters remained in the silk-wrapped bundle, kept in a place of honor in the library. New generations would read them someday, would learn about the woman who had survived impossible circumstances, and created an inheritance far more valuable than money, because that was my mother's true legacy. Not the evidence that brought down a criminal empire, but the proof that silence can be transformed into strength, that fear can be alchemized into courage, and that the families we build by choice can be stronger than the ones we inherit by blood. I still watch the ocean from the porch of that Victorian house, still feel my mother's presence in every room she prepared for me. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in from the Pacific and the house settles into evening quiet, I swear I can hear her voice carried on the wind, telling me she's proud, telling me I made the right choice, telling me that the inheritance of silence has finally been broken.